Now, if you're familiar with an interesting essay turned into a book by Robert Kagan called On Paradise and Power, he talks about this issue in soft power and hard power, and he makes the point the Europeans talk about soft power because they don't have hard power. And we talk about hard power because we have it. And so all these lofty principles are really compensation for the fact that the EU nations have, as one of the leaders of NATO once put it, they're military pygmies. They spend hardly anything on their militaries. They have very little military capability. And praise, to finish up, is due to all who, if not so superior to human nature as to refuse dominion, yet respect justice more than their position compels them to do. In other words, the Athenians saying, you may think we're bad, but given the power we have, we could be a lot worse. So we should be given some, credit for not using our power that we have. Now notice what Thucydides, contrary to the sort of European ideal that I believe the current administration also endorses, right? States pursue their interests. That's what they do. They pursue their interests. And they will find lofty sort of ideals that they say is what they're really motivating their behavior. But when the day is done, they are working to increase their own power and their own influence and to gratify their own interests. And we simply have to recognize that. Now this assumes, as does the EU ideal, assumes a sort of vision of human nature. So does this. And the idea of human nature that Thucydides has is that we are irrational creatures. Our motivations are irrational. We are rational, of course. We can think rationally and plan, but that will always be subordinated to these other irrational impulses like fear, or like honor, or like interest, our self-interest. What's the interest of a state? Power, more territory, more wealth, greater trading sphere, greater position vis-a-vis other states. And all throughout his history of the Peloponnesian War, we have passages that show us what happens in times of stress in a society when law begins to break down under the impact of war, etc., how human nature manifests itself. In Book 2, he talks about the effect of the plague on Athens. And it released what he calls lawless extravagance. And it's a brilliant description in Book 2 of how the behavior of the Athenians under the stress of the plague, remember they were all crammed together within the long walls, because they weren't going to fight the Spartans in an infantry battle, and the plague broke out, and because they were so packed together, its virulence was increased, and people were dying. And he describes how, in those circumstances, all of the things that usually control people's behavior, shame and all these sorts of things, even respect for the gods, that all begins to break down, and then what he calls lawless extravagance begins to manifest itself. In other words, people aren't naturally good. They are good because their circumstances allow them to be good. Change the circumstances and their true nature will manifest itself. Even better, and if there's one consequence of my talk today that I would fervently hope for, is that you will go read Thucydides. And in Book 3 is one of the brilliant passages in historical writing. This is describing the revolution and the civil wars that broke out, particularly in the island of Corcyra, modern Corfu. And he documents what happens in the breakdown of social order, even in the breakdown of language. And let me read you this, a couple of passages on that. He's talking about the effects of revolution. The sufferings which revolution entailed upon the cities were many and terrible. Such have occurred and always will occur as long as the nature of mankind remains the same. And notice what he's saying. Human nature is human nature. It's not evolving and changing and it's going to become something else as the Enlightenment ideal would have it. It's constant. And so you can expect the same sorts of things to happen in similar circumstances. In peace and prosperity, states and individuals have better sentiments because they do not find themselves suddenly confronted with imperious necessities. It's a wonderful phrase, imperious necessities. Right? These are fear, greed, whatever, and these are imperious. They command us. They drive our behavior. But war takes away the easy supply of daily wants, and so proves a rough master that brings most men's character to a level with their fortunes. Another passage. Now, this passage, by the way, this is in Book 3. Some scholars don't accept this as Thucydides, but there's no consensus on that. He goes on, in the confusion into which life was now thrown in the cities, human nature, always rebelling against the law and its master, gladly showed itself ungoverned in passion, above respect for justice and the enemy of all superiority. We chafe against the law when circumstances arise, law weakens, then our passions, our interests, the irrational part of us is going to drive our behavior. Now notice, this is a very different view of human nature from the modern Enlightenment view that I sketched out earlier. Okay. One of the great examples of how this view of human nature affects state behavior. In other words, why do states do what they do? The state is just manifesting in the collective citizens their natures, their fear or their desire for honor or their desire for interest. And this is the great description in Book 6 of the Athenian assembly debating whether or not to attack, this is in 415 BC, attack the powerful democratic state of Syracuse in Sicily. One of the great military disasters in history. I mean, you're in a war with an enemy close, and so you're going to pick a fight with an enemy 1,000 miles away, right? And of course, it ends up disastrously for the Athenians. Now, Thucydides recreates the debate in the assembly, and what he shows us is that the assembly is motivated purely by self-interest. All attempts on the part of Nicias to rationally argue to them why they shouldn't do this, and all his arguments are very sound, nonetheless, everybody in the assembly is thinking, I'm going to get something out of this. And when Thucydides describes this effect, he uses an amazing word in this passage. He uses the word eros. He says, an eros fell upon the assembly. Eros, sexual passion, right? A desire as intense as sexual desire, attacked them. And they voted for this disastrous expedition. So, in response to the sort of, we'll call it EU ideal of interstate relations, foreign relations, one I believe clearly is endorsed by the current administration. I think it explains his positive reception in Europe, because now he's brought America back to where they think America should be. In response, I think Thucydides would say, well, it's delusional. That's not why states do what they do. States don't want to get along and be free necessarily and be prosperous. As Professor Fears pointed out last night, I think it is a great point. They want all sorts of things. States want all sorts of things. They want security. They want power. They want to dominate their neighbors. They want to be right with God. Whatever. They have all sorts of other motives that determine how they treat other states. And that's a reflection of human nature, a human nature that is constant through time.